Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, June 9th, and I want to ask you, what do you think what's the biggest news story? What should we be focusing on? Because when I turned on the news last night, everything was about these LA protests.
Yeah.
I don't hear about the topics we talk about. Sometimes they obviously pop up, and that's why I'm watching the news. But then it makes me think,
Uh-huh.
is there other things that I should be focusing on? Do I get too absorbed into just what's happening in the Middle East and the
Right.
Ukraine-Russia war?
Well, actually, all of these, the Ukraine-Russia war is always important, and what's happening in the Middle East is always important. And for the reasons that we've always stated. I would say like maybe two stories that haven't been getting any attention, but really deserve a lot more, are Iran and China. And we really haven't talked about them. There's not a whole lot to say, but there is, potential very serious trouble brewing on both fronts there. And
Okay.
which would, again, is the trouble is that, I don't want to downplay the riots in LA, but, I think the significance of the events taking place, on those two fronts are, certainly overshadow what's happening, should overshadow, rather, I should say, what's happening in LA.
Okay. You said, the conflicts that we always talk about, why they're so important, but could you restate the reasons again why we should be paying attention? Just kind of recap, just to remind us why
Right.
this is such an important event that's happening in both of these conflicts.
Right. Okay. Well, I say with it, actually in both conflicts, it's not just they potentially will have a huge impact. They've already had a huge impact. They've already changed the world. And in the case of the Russia-Ukraine war, I think it's first of all it's the failure of the West, of NATO in particular, to achieve its objectives. When they went into this war, okay, of course they're using Ukraine as a proxy, as we well know. They believed that they could bring about the collapse of Russia. It was clear. If you go back to the statements that they made at the time, there was a Munich Security Conference that I think took place just a couple days before the war erupted, and they knew what was coming, and they were giddy, with excitement about it. They felt that this was their chance to actually realize their dreams, which was the overthrow of Putin's government, the possible disintegration of Russia. It would be the taming of Russia. This is their dream. This has been their dream for a long time. And then, of course, they had their economic sanctions prepared, which they were clearly confident would bring Russia to its knees. Now, on both fronts, they have failed, and that is enormous. Just that fact in itself is enormous. It has changed the world because the rest of the world has looked at it and said, "Wait a second." Every country in the world was in awe of NATO and in particularly of the U.S. There's a sense that and of let's say the G7, which is largely consists of the same countries. Um, they feared the economic power and the military power of the West, and they would kowtow to it. They would bow down. They would make all kinds of compromises of their own sovereignty. This was true of the nations of the world. And then they saw Russia. They saw that again these powers using NATO and then uh, Europe and the U.S. concentrating, focusing all its economic power to destroy it, just sort of like a laser being focused at Russia. Russia is going to be smoking ruins, in economically speaking, and it failed. The military effort, wasn't quite so immediate. I think that took some time because again, a lot of people didn't understand how Russia went in with really a very limited force. And as Putin later said, they didn't even really have the forces to conquer Ukraine. That was never their intention. It clearly wasn't. So there was some confusion about what was happening on the military front initially, but it was crystal clear what happened on the economic front, and that had enormous repercussions. And now over time, the rest of the world understands again all these weapon systems that have been so hyped and that they feared. All of them are um, paper tigers, and this is what they see. And this has changed the world. So now you have countries like Saudi Arabia. Okay, they haven't abandoned the U.S., but they have fundamentally changed their position. They're moving towards the multipolar world. They understand that the U.S. is just one pole. It's no longer, though the U.S. wants to think of itself as the world hegemon, other countries don't realize that it no longer is, or its days are very much numbered, and they are already fundamentally changing their policies. So this is we go into other things, but I think that's right there. We can see the huge impact of this war, and it will continue, I believe, to have this impact as time goes on, and as Russia's military victory becomes clearer and clearer, with every passing month, that will again diminish the reputation of NATO in the eyes of the world. And again, that just fundamentally changes things, and it helps to give birth. It is giving birth to this multipolar world. So that conflict is extremely important. And then, of course, the attack on Gaza, the genocide on Gaza, that too has really changed the world. And that's whereas the Ukraine-Russia war really affected the two of the three pillars, the economic and the military. I think it's what's happening here is this war on Gaza by Israel with full U.S. support has fundamentally shaken the third pillar, which is soft power, is the moral power, because the U.S. is complicit in genocide and the world sees it, and so that too right there has had a huge impact, on the world. It's changed the world, and it has brought us. It is bringing to end the U.S.-led world hegemony, and it is giving rise to the multipolar world. So both of those conflicts are very, very important already, just for what they've done, and I think they're going to continue to have that effect. I mean, unfortunately, I'm afraid this genocide will continue, and it will just be the final nail in the coffin of the U.S.'s moral reputation.
When you say that, the West at the Munich Security Conference, their goal was to collapse Russia, to destroy Russia, are we talking about a regime change, fundamentally change the government, not necessarily break up the country, right? Or some people maybe.
Well, some of them clearly had that thought, but not necessarily, to at least affect a change of government. And they had this belief, which is just ridiculous, actually. Clearly, they just didn't understand Russia, that that whoever replaced Putin would be just much more compliant, like a Yeltsin all over again. And that they could, they could cause him to submit, he would be a willing puppet. And that, again, I think that was ridiculous. Anybody who replaces Putin, or who would have replaced him back then, I think would have been much more hardline. Again, Putin has been just really the epitome of reasonableness and caution. And again, within Russia, most of the criticism is coming from the hardliners and the nationalist side of the spectrum.
Right. So we always say that this war is existential in nature for Russia because of that. The goal has been stated. We want to bring down Russia, get rid of regime change. But the longer that we have been invested in this war with the West in general, is it becoming existential for NATO or the EU or Western hegemony in general? And that's scary, if so.
Yeah, I would say it's not actually existential for Europe or the U.S. They could just say, "Hey, forget it," and everything, and everything would be fine, because Russia has no intention of invading. It has no intention, nor does it have the means, to invade and occupy Europe, or all of Europe, or a big part of it. That's just not going to happen. Much less the United States, which is way over there on the other side of the ocean. So it isn't existential for them per se, but it's existential for their hegemony. I think that's what it comes down to. It's because, again, their reputation, which has already been severely damaged, would be irreparably damaged, if there's just a clear-cut Russian victory, which I think is inevitable.
Right. I mean, I always thought when I was surprised about the stance that Europe had towards this war. When Trump won the election and was coming in, I thought there would be a sigh of relief from EU leaders, like, "Oh, thank goodness, now we can get out of this conflict that we're being dragged into in Europe because it's been horrible for our economies. We're becoming very unpopular. This
Mm,
is not good. We don't. This is not something we want." But then I was just kind of shocked that they were upset. They're
yeah,
like, "No, we got to keep this war going." And I
right.
think that represents that these leaders believe that it is existential in nature, and that if they lose this war, of course, their political careers will be over. But maybe more so, I don't know if they're concerned about Western hegemony or they're more concerned about NATO itself will be over or the European Union, this project will be over. Do you think it's
Mhm.
existential for those organizations, the EU, NATO?
Yeah, very well may be. I think we, I, what you said just brought to mind that scene of the organizer of the most recent Munich Security Conference, the one where Vance gave his speech. And when it was over, the organizer actually broke down in tears and said, "This is the end of the rules-based international order." You can see that there's a real, right there, you can see there is an emotional investment in these notions. When you say the rules-based international order, you're really talking about Western-led hegemony. And so that's what they see as being threatened. He could see the end of it, and he broke down in tears. This is what they're fighting for. This is what they can't let go of. And the more that they double down on it, I think in the end, the harder the fall will be. If they pulled out earlier, say, this was stupid. It really doesn't matter to us. Um, let's just make this deal with the Russians. It's not, it's unfortunate, but it's really kind of a regional issue. It's between Ukraine and Russia. Could have done that, um, but they didn't, and they made it into an existential matter for not for their countries at this point, but again for hegemony. And they have stated that again and again. We just can't let them win. If they do, the consequences will be dire. And then when they win, where are they going to be? Maybe NATO will survive, but it clearly will be weakened. It'll be weakened in the eyes of the world, and I think of even the people in Western countries.
Right. Right. So now if it's existential for Russia and the West,
In different
this,
ways, yeah, very
yeah,
different
and
ways.
right, in different ways, but this is what makes the conflict potentially so dangerous is that the longer that the West doubles down, like you said, the fall will be harder. They're making it existential for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it will be existential, I think, the longer they go on for NATO, the more that they get involved into this and the European Union project in general, Western hegemony. So that that just makes me think that the only thing maybe potentially holding back an all-out conflict between NATO is really just the populations within those countries. They are the ones that have to rein it in because they have to say, well, this isn't existential for us. We're not worried about Russian troops marching in and taking over our homes or whatever it is. But the leaders have made it existential. So I think that's the battleground that's going to have to be fought, right? We're going to
Mm-hmm.
have to see some type of change come from the populations need to rise up. Because as it goes on, these leaders, if they have their way, they'll make it more and more existential to the point where they're
Mm-hmm.
going to say, we send in troops, we send in longer range missiles. Now it's time for nuclear war because it's existential for us.
Yeah, well, yeah, they're already raising the alarm. They trying to convince their populations that yeah, this is serious. That Russia, we're going to be at war with Russia. So far, the European people have not risen to the bait. They I don't think you see a real major shift in support for direct intervention in Ukraine or for increased military budgets. That's just not there. And in general, there seems to be a lot of anger in places like the UK about um, the focus on Ukraine at the expense of domestic needs. And I think that's what I think that's what you would find if you look carefully at all the countries of Europe. Um, so far it hasn't worked. These leaders, like people like Merz, are working hard. They're trying to scare their people. And maybe at some point they'll succeed. And maybe there may be some dirty trick like a false flag or something that will fool the populations. False flags have a long history and have often been used um, as excuses for war. As a casus belli, and they often do fool the people. There's always that danger. They're not having success so far, but they keep on trying, and they have resources. They have dirty tricks. We'll see what happens.
Okay, well, before we dive too deep into Ukraine, Russia, I think it'd be nice to hit on the two topics that you presented earlier, saying that these are huge developments that have kind of been pushed to the side in mainstream media, and I think with a lot of people, and that's with regards to the Iran nuclear deal, and also with China. So, where would you want to start?
Let's talk about China. We haven't spoken much about China. Pete Hegseth gave a speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue. I think it was like a week and a couple of days ago. And what it really was a change of tone from previous speeches that have been given by American representatives, American, secretaries of defense in the past. And interesting, normally actually the Chinese attend these conferences. This year, the Chinese did not attend. And he gave a very fiery speech directed against China. He said that the threat from China is imminent, and he's essentially saying that war is a real possibility. We have to prepare for it. You must start increasing your defense budgets. He sounded like maybe like Keir Starmer or Merz does in Europe. He's trying to do the same thing in China. Now, a lot of these countries are part of what you could say are U.S.-led security arrangements, but they also have very, very close ties, obviously, to China. China is the behemoth in the area, and especially an economic behemoth, and so they have very substantial trade links. And I think this is not something we wanted to hear, but he pushed it. He pushed it hard and said, I said again that Taiwan may very well be the trigger of war. We hope it doesn't happen. We need to establish deterrence. They're saying, you need to build up your defense budgets and whatever. But if the deterrence doesn't work, then we'll have to go, he's essentially saying the U.S. to war and to win this war. So it was, a very, let's say, combative speech, and a very hostile, hostile against the China. So there's that. There is a rising temperature, let's say, in the region over the potential of a military conflict. And at the same time, okay, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, I have a short clip from that speech he gave in Singapore. I think maybe I can play it real quick, so
okay,
people can see. It's just a few seconds, or we'll see.
Again, to be clear, any attempt by Communist China to conquer Taiwan by force would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be.
Okay, that's just a small excerpt, but I think it kind of captures that sentiment that of like we need to gear up for a potential war with China.
Right.
Crazy.
Right.
It's really crazy.
Yeah. And I think also I want to point out that he, again, in the past, the U.S. maintained, a policy of strategic ambiguity. Essentially, if they made it purposely unclear as to how they would respond to an attempt to militarily reunify China. Like, in other words, if mainland China made an attempt to just take back Taiwan by military force, they wouldn't state what their response would be. That's strategic ambiguity. Maybe we would do nothing, but maybe we would, intervene militarily. But that strategic ambiguity began to disappear actually under Biden, who I think 4 different times said that they would fight back. I think each time, like the Secretary or the State Department would walk back his comments, but it happened 4 times. And so, that raised eyebrows around the world, and especially in China. And then the way he's talking now is the same thing. It just would mean war. Before, because one thing that has to be remembered is that China, first of all, regards Taiwan as its own territory. That's always been its policy, ever since the PRC's policy, ever since it took power in 1949, or at least shortly after 1949. It is the understanding of more importantly, of actually the U.S. The U.S. State Department also regards Taiwan as Chinese territory. And they said, yes, they they agree that actually Taiwan needs to be reunified with China over time, but they express the hope that this will happen peacefully. That was the policy, but we are clearly drifting away from it. And we're starting to look at Taiwan as sort of an outpost of our military power, or, a proxy against China. And I think you can see that the spirit of that new thinking in Pete Hegseth's speech.
What do most of the Taiwanese feel? Do they want to be a proxy? I mean, you think that if they're watching what's happened in Ukraine, right, and you just sort of see this general shift in power of just what we've talked about in the beginning of this conversation, like, this is crazy. No way. Get out of here, America. Don't use this as a battering ram against China.
Yeah. Well, the current ruling party, which it has to be said actually doesn't even have didn't win with a majority of the vote. They won with a plurality. Okay, they are they are in favor of, you could say, a kind of almost a proxy relationship with the U.S. They're kind of like the ultra-nationalists. They are, the Taiwanese nationalists within Taiwan. And they have been pushing the envelope. They have been going right up to the red lines that China has declared. They're careful so far not to cross them, but they understand, or they believe, I should say, that the U.S. will back them, and that empowers them to pursue reckless and provocative policies vis-a-vis mainland China. So that's the ruling party right now. It's the Minjindang, which is means like the People's Progressive Party, but it's a nationalist party. Again, it's a different kind of nationalism, a different flavor from what you have in Ukraine, but it is a nationalism, and it's a nationalism like the Ukrainian nationalists feel empowered by U.S. backing. Then the majority of people, I think, would prefer to maintain the status quo in Taiwan, which is to say that, okay, we're not actually a separate country, but, not officially, but de facto we are. Let's get along with China because, hey, this relationship is very good for business, and it has been, obviously. There are the economies are very extensively linked, and to the mutual benefit of both sides. And so I think most people have that attitude. And then there are some, I really don't know what the percentage is, but it's true, for example, of your aunts in Taiwan that would just as soon, especially one of them, and I don't think she's, totally fringe, but actually would just as soon would like to have Taiwan become part of China, not just, not just on paper, but in a really substantive way, become a province of China, which is, technically it is, but, de facto it is not at this point. And I think it's understandable. Those kind of people were very, very unusual and tended to be hard left people in Taiwan. Actually, I remember meeting one at the Chinese school that I attended decades ago in Taiwan. But things have changed, and so it's actually people that are more conservative or traditional actually favor unification with China now, and because they see that China is doing well, it's prospering, it's communist, but really in name only. It's a nationalist government that has really delivered the goods for its people, and they would like to be a part of it. They're proud of what they've done, and they consider themselves, say, we're Chinese, which clearly they are. Again, you have the same kind of thing happening that you have in Ukraine, where a lot of people want to pretend, especially on the nationalist side, that we're not Chinese. They don't have it. We're completely different people. But there are deep historical links, and it's hard to pretend that actually you're not. Even if you speak, the Taiwanese language and you're a nationalist, so many of your customs and attitudes are just fundamentally Chinese. And I think you would actually find the same thing in Ukraine, even among the nationalists. There's this pretense, this idea that we have no relationship, neither blood links or, cultural, when there are clearly very, very close ties. That these societies are deeply intertwined. So it's happening at, whether you're looking at business or culture or whatever, you have to say that there is a fundamental split. There are people that want to continue to push the nationalist line to the point that they could even risk war. They don't want it, but they're willing to risk it, and they think that they can get away with it because of U.S. backing. But then on the other side, again, there's that kind of the mushy middle. A lot of people just say, let's just let things continue as they are. Let's not be provocative. Okay, let's say, promise it sometime in the distant future to reunify. In the meantime, let's just trade with China. And then there are people who would really like to see it happen sooner rather than later. And I can't, I haven't looked at polls, so I can't give you percentages. It's just based on, what I know from the news and from my own experiences in Taiwan and from what I hear from your mother.
So do you think the strategy that Pete Hegseth is trying to adopt is to support this nationalist independence movement in Taiwan and push them to be more and more provocative towards China and try to get them to declare independence, and then that would trigger a response from the United States to come to Taiwan's aid?
I don't know if they actually want them to. I think they probably advise them to not actually cross the red lines. I suppose there are some people, maybe even Pete Hegseth himself, that do want war. It's clear that there are true, China hawks within the U.S. administration. It's not just the current administration, but in past administrations. They've been there for decades now, and I think they've increased in number and in passion too. Some of them want war and probably would goad the nationalists into crossing the red lines. I think most of them just would like to stop short of war. You found out actually, like in Ukraine, I think like most of the papers, think tank papers and whatever, said, we'll use Ukraine as a proxy, just to goad Russia to force it to divert resources, but let's stop just short of war because that could be pretty nasty. Let's calibrate it. And I think you're going to find the same thing in the case of Taiwan. But
why? What's the point? Does that actually? How does that weaken China, though? I don't understand. If anything, it makes China stronger. They gear up like, well, okay, clearly there's this threat, so we got to end up becoming stronger militarily to counter this. Yeah, right. Why? What's the thinking? What's the logic behind it?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's very good thinking. Again, in the case of, if you look at Russia, obviously the thinking was deeply flawed. They felt that they could use Ukraine as just to pressure Russia. And of course, it led to the war. And I think probably you have the same thing. It's like, okay, this is a chip that we have on our board that we can use against China. But that's foolish. Again, the Chinese are not going to be pressured into changing their policies. And in fact, if they see greater intervention, they're just going to, their own resolve is going to increase. But we've just made this kind of mistake again and again. We don't really understand our adversaries. We have this notion, and still maybe it's just lingering attitude from the unipolar moment that we can apply pressure and thereby change the policies of our adversaries. And that's just not true anymore. Maybe it was true 20, 25 years ago, but it's not true anymore. It clearly isn't.
Right. I mean, okay, prior to the SMO, we talked about the Munich Security Conference, there is this idea adopted by the vast majority of the world that NATO in the West was omnipotent. It could impose its will. Well, we found out that didn't work out very well. It's been exposed rapidly. Not only there have we seen it being exposed, but we just lost to the Houthis in the Red Sea, and then who in the right mind's like, okay, great, now it's time to take on the Chinese.
Yeah, right, exactly.
What is the like? I understand if what happened in the Red Sea never happened. what happened in Ukraine never happened, then you could be thinking like maybe that's out there, that okay, maybe the US and NATO are all powerful and they can do this, and we don't know the ability of the Chinese, so I think you get away with it. Now it just seems complete suicidal. I don't understand how anybody in Taiwan could still support this, and I just don't see why anybody in the West would want this. It just seems catastrophic. It's like I like long shots, betting on the underdogs, but this is odds 1 in a million now. Like, what are we doing?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, it is extraordinary, but I guess it's just you say pride goeth before a fall. It's just hubris. It's just there's an unwillingness to recognize what's going on here. There's this faith that just remains unshaken on the part of many of our elite, that we are the exceptional nation, and there really aren't any constraints on our power, and we can't possibly lose a war that we choose to prosecute. If we just have the willpower. And the failures in the past is because these were wimpy Democrats or whatever. It was. But we because we're America, we can win. You can remember the comments that like Biden made. So again, it's not just the Trump administration. It's part of the mindset of the political elite in this country going back, ever since the 90s.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right. Because what we saw, of course, in the Red Sea should have told us, if you got any ideas of fighting some sort of naval battle, because that's essentially what it would be. We would be dependent largely on naval power. This is on the other side of the ocean from us. And, it wouldn't be a ground battle. It would be a battle fought, largely by missiles. And our forces would be, our missiles would be launched in largest part from our naval vessels. And we saw how vulnerable they were in the Red Sea. We saw the evasive maneuver that the aircraft carrier had to take, and the fact that they were hiding up at the north end of the Red Sea against the Houthis. So what do they think they're going to do against China? And China has been preparing for this war forever. It's just, and I think over time, just as, is the case with Iran, time has favored the Chinese too. As both there are these technological changes, again, that give the advantage to missiles over ships. And then there's just the fact, too, that they, like the Iranians, they have been building up their forces and planning for this. And again, we're talking about the largest, manufacturing power in the world by far right now. So if this turns, if the war isn't decided quickly, it will be decided in time in favor of China, because China has an enormous edge when it comes to, just, again, production of military munitions, just as Russia has shown, but it's just 10 times as true for China. I mean, that's just, so I don't even know what they're thinking. I agree. It's just absurd, but, all I can say again, it's hubris. It's just this, you just can't let go. You see how these people talk, everybody from Trump on down, it's just like, a lot of chest thumping and, threats and whatever. It's just, they can't let go of this idea that, that they are the undisputed hegemon. There was a time when they could get away with this, but that time has passed.
It's utter insanity. I mean, we talk about manufacturing capacity. Just one thing I want to remind viewers is that China has a shipbuilding capacity advantage of 275 to 1 to the United States. So if you're going to talk about a naval battle, China can outbuild you 275 to 1. And if they need to ramp up, they have the ability to scale where the US doesn't. So it's so insane. It's hard for me to believe, because you said, pride goes before the fall. It's like, well, we were just saying earlier that we already fell. That's what the Ukraine war showed. We fell militarily, we fell economically, we've fallen morally thanks to Gaza. So we already fell down. So it's like, you're saying it's the hubris, but
yeah, but there's still denial. I mean, it's just like in the case of, you still get a lot of people saying, I think you're starting to hear some dissident voices let's say from the establishment, from the security communities and the State Department, some dissident voices, with regard to the Ukraine-Russia war. But you still get a lot of these statements like, okay, yeah, the sanctions haven't worked yet, but the Russian economy is just teetering on the edge and it's going to collapse next month or next year. We keep on hearing that. And, claims again that, okay, yeah, they're advancing, but they're advancing very slowly and they're suffering huge losses. They're on the verge of collapse. You still hear that kind of stuff. So there are ways to deny what's going on. And then, yeah, in the case of Gaza, I mean, it's hard to deny that, how our image, our reputation has fundamentally suffered. But the Israeli firsters are as passionate as ever. And, they lay all the blame on anti-Semitism. And, we simply just have to support them. There's denial at many different levels. I think eventually that is just going to collapse, and especially if we get in a war with China. I think, again, another thing should have been a really warning shot is that this China is not going to submit to any kind of pressure, is, of course, the tariff war. China did not cave in. And apparently, we know the deal that was made, 30% on Chinese goods, 10% on U.S. goods, a big rollback from the 145%. Maybe some of them were up at 245, which is not really clear, but at least 145. But at the same time, China actually put restrictions on rare earths. And apparently they haven't lifted those restrictions. That's when you're talking about the negotiations. I think that's what the U.S. is trying to do, and they're not doing it. And this is what I've heard anywhere. That's what the reports are, and this is driving the Americans crazy because they're dependent on it. Like 90% of refined rare earths come from China, and the rare earths are essential to military technology. So it's just like, guys, again, but why didn't you think about this before you launched your economic war? And now the Chinese are saying, why should we send these to you? You're threatening war against us. So why should we send some sort of, absolutely essential materials for building weapons that you plan to use against us? We're not doing that. And so far they've held firm. Why shouldn't they?
It also just hammers home the insanity of any type of conflict with China. If we rely on Chinese goods and refined rare earth materials for our own military industrial complex. So do you think that if we were in a war with China, China would continue to supply the United States with what it needs to create it to keep building weapons? Of course not.
Right.
I think you told me over 50% of all weapons produced by the U.S. military industrial complex, you have Chinese components in them, right?
Yeah.
Something like that. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's even more. I mean, just everything, just even things just like screws and bolts, I don't know if that all comes from China too, probably.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we can replace those.
I don't know.
Components.
Not at mass, maybe. I don't know. Who knows? Yeah. It takes a while to just build up, these plants and, sure, simple things. Maybe we can spit out a bunch of washers, but, screws, they have, you got those little, it's a little more advanced.
I don't know about that, but anyway,
yeah.
No, but we are dependent. It is just crazy. It is. It's absolutely insane. But look, we have Lindsey Graham has his bone-crushing sanctions package that he has prepared, and he's claimed to have 80 senators on board for it. And that would just be an absolute, that would just end all trade with China. It would actually do the same to Europe, and it would actually do the same to the U.S., if we continue our purchases of uranium, because we actually depend on Russia for uranium, and that's one of the things that he listed. So I just don't know what planet the guy's living on. I mean, again, he's just. I remember Viktor Orban said when you're talking about the madness in Europe over the economic sanctions that did so much damage to Europe itself. He said, "No, we didn't shoot ourselves in the foot. We shot ourselves in the lung," and that's the same thing. But they're just throughout the West. The leadership is just really become detached from reality. I think maybe just being the top dog for so long. It has these consequences. You stop thinking, about hard realities, and you just, you feel like everything is just sort of like you make your own reality. In fact, I can't remember who it was, but it was somebody in the Bush administration, the George W. Bush, that made that statement. We create our own reality. And back then, it was almost like that. You could do anything, and it might fail, but then you have this tremendous soft power, and you can just declare it a victory. Or it just seemed like. So you got used to thinking without restraints and just, saying, everything is about narrative. We just, what's the point about actually working about the hard realities because we're the top dog? It's those, the underdog has to think hard about what's real. And I think we just stopped thinking about what's real. So, we just get these absurd proposals and policies, very self-destructive policies. And,
right.
Yeah, it could lead us into war.
Seem to be getting more and more absurd. I'm always hoping to see some glimmer of realism coming out of our elites and our establishment, but it just doesn't seem to be there. They just keep doubling down on stupid. It just you want to shake them, be like, "Wake up! Hey, what are we doing here? This is insane."
Right.
How do
you
wake
do
them
see
up?
it sometimes with respect to Russia under Trump, but you wonder what that is. I think some of that is actual realism. So people have studied the problem and understand what's going on. People like J.D. Vance and even Kellogg himself has made some realistic comments recently. There seems to be a glimmer of realism there when it comes to Russia. But you wonder how much of that is about pivoting to Asia, really to China. Because there are all these China, uber hawks who say, Russia's not the issue, it's China. So let's just get the hell out of there and focus on China. I'm afraid maybe that realism is just perhaps just a strategic choice in favor of pursuing another kind of delusion somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Just going back quickly to the rare earth materials that China is not sending to the United States anymore. Obviously, this has got to put a huge amount of pressure on the United States. The military-industrial complex relies on this. So what do you think this means? They're going to try to hammer out more negotiations? China's going to play hardball? Where is this leading in terms of the trade war? Or
I know that it was a tweet that, or whatever you call a Truth Social post.
A truth.
A truth that Trump posted about a week ago. He expressed his frustration with the Chinese and with Xi Jinping in particular. He says, they're not compromising. What's going on here? This is really upsetting. And I think he didn't state what it was, but I think it may be about the rare earths. That was what they're, hoping that they would compromise on, and start shipping those again.
So where does this lead the United States if they can't get them?
In a real, difficult position because again, I think there's so many military technologies that are dependent on it. I think, but the thing about rare earths is that they can be used to in components that can withstand very high temperatures. I think that's one of the reasons that they're so valuable. Like in a missile that is traveling at hypersonic speeds or whatever, you have to have components that can withstand very, very high temperatures, the kind of temperatures that occur at those speeds. And that's just one example. I think there's probably other reasons why they're so valuable to military technology. Now, rare earths are found around the world. Some people say they're not rare. That's not really true. They are rare, but they're not rare in the sense that they're just concentrated in a couple of places. They're found around the world. They're rare everywhere. You could put it that way. I think they may be more common in some regions than others, or less rare in some regions than others. Just put it that way. The thing is that it costs a lot of money, and it takes a great deal of effort to extract them and refine them. And the Chinese made that investment, and so they, it's something that I'm sure that we could do, but it'd probably take at least a decade to start really producing. I don't know the exact amount of time, but it's going to, take a huge investment, a lot of time to get where we could actually be producing our own rare earths in significant quantities.
I don't think the EPA would allow it either.
Yeah, well, that's a big part of the problem. Yeah, it's strip mining. So you can't just do it, you obviously can't do it in urban land or agricultural land, because again, the cost, you're destroying land that's valuable in other ways. I'm not sure, but I think probably in China they're doing it in the Gobi Desert or some place like that.
Mm. Okay, well, let's move over to Iran because I think this is a huge story that I haven't seen hardly any coverage over is that Iran has found a treasure trove of Israeli nuclear documents and
Right.
secrets. At least that's what they're saying.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about this?
Well, I think I know just what you know. I read that story. I read a couple of stories about that. And yeah, they say that like this is the largest intelligence leak in the history of the Mossad. Or they, they were able to um, pilfer these documents, and bring them back to Iran, through agents that they had in Israel. Um, Now, I don't know if it's true or not. One thing that I find I don't understand why Iran is declaring this, because you would think it would be to their advantage to keep the Israelis in the dark about what they know. But maybe they found out, this is just a guess, pure speculation on my part. Okay, they did, in fact, acquire these documents, all this intelligence. And then they learned shortly thereafter or during the process that the Israelis became aware of it. And so there's no harm in declaring it publicly, and why they would do that, I'm not sure. Maybe it's just uh, to uh, to reassure their own citizens, or to impress their own citizens. Again, Iran has been at the receiving end of a lot of covert attacks, over the years, and there have been clear intelligence failures within Iran. And I think there's a lot of criticism directed against the intelligence services within Iran, counterintelligence there. And so maybe this is a chance for them to toot their own horn, or there may be some reason too that they want other countries to know about this. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to make of that story. It may be true. Who knows?
Well, if they announced it publicly, then why not just release it? Because otherwise you
Yeah.
just say, well, we have this, but no one can see it. And then that becomes a problem, right? So if you make an announcement that you have it, that means you have the intention to release it, surely, right?
Right. I don't know. Yeah, that's a good question. That's what I find myself wondering. So I have my doubts about it, but there may be some logic behind it. I haven't really seen that explained. I just don't know what to make of that story. I'll be honest with you.
What happens? What happens if they do release it? Like the whole
Yeah,
world
well,
is
it depends
aware.
on what
Like,
the contents are, really. That's um,
well, if it's just irrefutable proof that okay, here's proof that Israel has a nuclear weapons program,
okay,
which we all
right.
know.
That's something, right? Yeah, yeah, that would obviously be to their advantage. I guess that's the main thing. That would be the main intelligence find, and this would, I think, reveal the double standard. I think most countries are aware of it, but it would just make it glaringly obvious that again, Israel has nuclear weapons. And they are not part of the NPT. They acquired it actually through theft of information and materials from the U.S. I believe during the early 1960s. And okay, Israel has this nuclear arsenal, and yet they feel like they can, demand that that Iran not only not acquire nuclear weapons, but can't even have a conventional nuclear capability. For the production of electricity, and that's just a glaring double standard. It should be obvious to anybody, but this makes it even more obvious. And would, yeah, I guess that may be the main purpose of publicizing it. It's just to show the world that hey, look, we've been the ones who are really violating the NPT. I guess they're technically not violating because they're not part of it, but at least the spirit of the NPT is Israel. It's not ourselves. We're in complete compliance.
Right. Yeah, feel like if it's clear that it's out there, there has to be, there's always this kind of everybody knew in the United States, but because it wasn't the official stance that of Israel, we would just say, oh, we never broached that question. But if it just becomes irrefutable that they do have nuclear weapons, don't we have laws in place saying we can't sell weapons to this country because they are a nuclear armed power that's not part of the NTP, or that they would be subject to
Yeah,
sanctions from other countries? Because now it's undeniable.
yeah, Right. Well, I think that's true. But of course, we have a lot of laws on the books that actually should prevent us from supplying um, weapons and ammunition to Israel. And we violate those laws all the time. In fact, you may recall that during Biden's presidency, it came up that there was a question of whether Israel had violated some, human rights standards that were set in U.S. law. And clearly they had. I mean, not even, I think it was actually, the question was about the West Bank, and clearly they were. But um, but Blinken just simply declared that they were in complete compliance, and then the weapons continued to flow. So, I mean, I think that's just what's going to happen. Unfortunately, that's always what happens in the case of Israel. They'll just pretend, even though the evidence is out there, everybody knows it, and in fact, pretty much everybody knows it already. But if the Iranians actually release the documents, prove that this is going on, they'll still just pretend like it didn't happen. Because Israel's Israel, and Israel's not subject to the laws that all other countries are subject to.
What's the goal for Israel now? I mean, obviously, we know ethnic cleansing, creating greater Israel, but what we're seeing in Gaza, they're juggling this PR war that they're clearly losing. The people in Gaza, there's, who knows how many have been slaughtered so far, but it almost feels like it's going to just be this slow grind, this slow genocide. Like, how long can it go on? I mean, they can't kill everybody, right? I mean,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's gone on a lot longer than I thought it could. The world has shown way too much patience for this. Um, yeah, it's not
but it's wearing thinner the longer it goes on.
right.
It's just like there
Yeah,
has to be, I mean, I think probably Trump and the administration understand that this is not good for them either. I think they do want it to end, but there's always this question: why can't we make it stop? Okay, why can't we have it stop? Why can't we just stop sending bombs? It seems
yeah,
like a
right.
very simple thing to do,
Yeah,
but it just continues, and it just going. It seems like it
right.
just slowly grind out, and then
Yeah,
people are just
yeah,
getting sicker and sicker and more disgusted until what?
yeah. I don't know. I can say we've seen the first cracks in the edifice. Maybe they're just hairline fractures right at this point. But we have seen at least, Western leaders start to make real criticisms. Again, they're not backing it up with anything, and maybe they probably never will. But it is something. It shows that the pressure is building on them. Let's at least put it that way, um, and they're feeling it. And then we even see former defense ministers and generals and former prime minister of Israel admitting that, hey, we're committing war crimes, and we're killing babies, this kind of thing, and it's deliberate. These again are Israeli defense leaders, and a former prime minister Olmert. They're, they're haven't actually used the word genocide, but they're getting very close to it, and so that shows again that there is pressure that's building. Unfortunately, you just don't see it in Israeli society as a whole. There are these individuals. Um, so it's just sad to say, but I think it shows every sign of just going on and on. Give you some idea of like what the actual toll has been on the Gazans. There was a study that was done. It was an international collaboration of different researchers, and they estimated life expectancy in Gaza. I don't know how they do this, but these researchers have their way. They have their methods. So they said prior to October 7th, life expectancy in Gaza was actually pretty good. It was 75.5, which is really not bad, and but that has dropped to 40.5. That's according to the research, in recent months. So it's actually dropped by half. Now, what does that mean? Well, I mean, that could be reflected, it could be a reflection of different realities. Let's say we're talking about nearly half. Well, just to simplify things, we'll say it's half because it's really very nearly half of what it used to be. Um, or I should say a little bit more than half of what it used to be. Now, but let's just call it half. So that either could be that half of the population has been killed, Or you can look at the other extreme. Nobody was killed, but life expectancy for everybody has been reduced by a half. Either way, you're talking about something just catastrophic. You are talking about the deaths of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. I think there's no way to, some of the deaths, like we'll see, are happening now. There very well could be hundreds of thousands. I think probably. Well, there's really no question. And again, there are other studies. I think the Lancet did one that this was several months ago that estimated 250,000. Because again, you get these direct deaths that are recorded by the very limited health system that still exists there. But clearly the direct deaths are going to be higher than that. And then there are the indirect deaths, the people who just couldn't make it to the hospital, because of the war and so on and so forth. So, yeah, we're talking about potentially, right now, like even if the war stopped today, we're talking about like half the population of Gaza, either, people that have died already, people who will die in the next few months, but even people that are going to die 10 years from now or 20 years from now, but are dying 20, 30 years younger than they would have. We've talked about malnutrition. There are a lot of, many, we don't know how many, but at least dozens have died already directly of malnutrition. But how many have died, with malnutrition as a contributing factor? And these kids, they've been permanently damaged. So even if they're brought back, if they're fed and they recover from this, survive, they've already suffered permanent damage. And how many of them are going to die, are not going to have full lives. They're going to die, at age 40 or whatever. This is what we're looking at. And we're just getting estimates of the toll that has been taken. But it's going to be huge. Even if the war stops today.
There's something that I saw going around Twitter the other day about there's a Wikipedia page entry about the war in Gaza. We shouldn't really call it a war, but they had listed all the belligerents. And with the Israeli side on the Wikipedia page, it says, has the Israeli names to the commanders, and then it also has ISIS linked faction that is on side with Israel. And I believe there was some comment that Netanyahu made openly about activating ISIS essentially in Gaza. Do you know anything about this?
Yeah, I do. Let's see. Who was it? It was, I think, a former defense minister that, yeah, I can't, but, somebody very high rank, either a former prime minister or a former defense minister that made the accusation directly. I mean, he just said, as a matter of fact, he asserted that, Israel is using these ISIS-linked militias in Gaza, and Netanyahu didn't deny it. He just made it say, we use whatever approach is effective, and we know something about them. I think one faction or one militia is headed by a drug dealer, a former drug dealer, somebody who had been convicted and was jailed in Gaza prior to October 7th. And the other one was actually somebody who had been charged with murder, convicted murderer, and he too was in prison. I think the prison itself was bombed and they escaped, and now the Israelis are working with these guys and they have created these militias. And they have, apparently have ISIS links. I don't know exactly the nature of that. But that's what's going on. And it's just, there's no question about it. And then later, there were even satellite photos showing these militias operating in Israeli-controlled territory. They're there, and that's what they're using them against Hamas, trying to build up this counterforce. Now, it just sounds so wild, but it's the thing that both is the sort of thing that Israel and the U.S. has done in many previous cases, going all the way back, to the war, the Mujahideen war against the Soviet-supported Afghan regime and the Soviet army, way back in the 1980s. It's something that both Israel and we have done, again and again. We have used these as proxies, these forces, Al-Qaeda like forces, the Mujahideen, and here ISIS. So it's clearly happening.
Where did ISIS come from? Because I hear accusations saying that ISIS is a creation of Israel and CIA. Or do we know anything about this? Like, is it
Um,
in large part because people always say, why did ISIS never attack Israel? They're real busy
right,
killing, Shiites and Christians, but
right. Yeah,
Israel's
well,
their friend.
yeah. No, I think actually when we're talking about Syria, for example, and why that was Al Qaeda. I don't know if there was actually, in fact, the U.S. did wage war against ISIS and helped to eliminate ISIS from at least a part of, not all of Syria. I think they actually allowed a certain number to remain because, again, they saw them as, useful proxies against Assad. Um, I don't know about. I've heard that rumor. I don't know of the. I doubt that we actually created them, but clearly at different times we've seen them as useful. We have fought them. We did fight them clearly, and or, supported the Iraqi government in fighting ISIS in Iraq, and we did actually fight them at least in partially. Let's say maybe not. It wasn't a total war, but we did fight them in Syria as well.
Right,
Now
but
Al Qaeda is kind of a different story, especially in Syria, where clearly we had from the beginning that the Al Qaeda chapter in Syria is called Al Nusra, and we worked with them. And in fact, we have some emails going way back, to around 2011, admitting as much. To Hillary Clinton was aware of it. I think it was actually Jake Sullivan
right,
that
Jake
he said,
Sullivan
yeah,
to Hillary Clinton. Al
right,
Qaeda's on our
exactly,
side in
yeah,
Syria.
right. And he was talking about Al Nusra, and now we have the former head of now Al Nusra and the former head of the ISIS chapter in Syria, Al Jilani, or now Al Shara
Right.
or
So
whatever.
isn't that pretty
And yeah,
suspicious?
yeah,
Right.
yeah. And it was clear. Yeah, I think that we always maintained, even though we had a bounty on his head, we always maintained connections with him.
So we were
There's no
supporting
question
Al
about
Qaeda, and I think we were supporting ISIS. And when we say we don't talk about the United States, but Israel itself, okay, the United States fought ISIS in parts of Syria, Iraq. But did Israel ever do anything to really fight ISIS, or were they
I
always
don't.
this kind of?
Well, I'm not sure, but I don't think so, and I think it's because ISIS didn't really have any presence in southern Syria, where the Israelis were. But Al Qaeda, Al Nusra definitely did, and they did work with them. There's just no question about it. They treated their soldiers, provided them with small arms. And then you notice that, yeah, again, Al Nusra never attacked Israel, and then the current regime, headed by Mr. Al Nusra himself, is trying to make peace with Israel and will not attack him.
Yeah, the shame is that it takes everything that's in the Middle East, it takes a little bit of diligence to kind of understand the region. And I think the problem is just the vast majority of people won't put in the time to kind of understand the basics. So that way they can't, they're not aware of what's happened, that everything we've been told about the Middle East is a lie.
Mm-hmm.
That we were supporting Al Qaeda, the situation with ISIS. Most people don't know the difference between Sunni and Shia. The whole thing is just a mess, and they're able to just point at like they're all Arabs, they're all terrorists. This type of generalization. That's the
Right.
big problem. Instead of realizing that, like, wow, just how we have been feeding all the worst elements in the Middle
Right.
East, all of these terrorist factions. The the terrorism isn't coming out of Shia extremists. They are Sunni extremists that are backed by the United States and Israel. And
Right.
I just wish people could break through. I think a lot of people just know that there's something wrong, but that's the problem, is that it just,
Right.
they don't quite get it. They're like, oh yeah, they're the bad guys and Israel's helping us fight those bad guys, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No. No. You're right. And people should know it because, yeah. Again, people have a very simplistic picture. It's the West with Israel against the Muslim crazies, the Islamic extremists. And no, actually, when you look closely, it's those extremists that tend to be allied, with the West and Israel. That's completely true. Yeah, that's without a doubt.
Right. And you can
And
see,
fighting the moderates. I mean, that's been clearly the policy of Israel all along, is that they always try to support the hardliners and try to do their best to subvert and um, subvert the moderates. That's been their constant policy because, again, they do not want a peace deal. Let's just say that. It's just clear that they would like to maintain, they want to expand, and you can't expand if you have a peace deal. So you keep the hardliners in power because that gives you an excuse. Even there, it's not really much of an excuse, but it gives you an excuse to continue to expand. Hamas itself was the hardline group. Now, I'm not going to include Hamas. Well, they have been allied with the extremists, but they are not. They're not head choppers in the way that ISIS and Al Qaeda is. Despite all the efforts to just describe them as a pure terror organization, that's exactly how they're always described, even in Haaretz, the left-wing newspaper. It's not a fair characterization, but they were relatively hardline, and in general, but there are important exceptions. They have made gestures to say, yeah, we're open to a two-state solution, but in general, they've opposed it. And that is the reason that Netanyahu himself favored Hamas over, for example, the alternatives, which was, for the PLO and then Al Fatah. I think they're one and the same. But that's been Israeli policy all along. Support the hardline, the extremists where you can, and do whatever you can to actually neutralize the moderates, so that we continue with our expansion. We can always look for a military solution because that's what we want. We don't actually want a negotiated settlement. A negotiated settlement would mean fixed borders, and that's not what Israel wants. They want those borders to keep on moving.
What an awful state Israel is. It's just so out of control. It's really wild. Okay,
and,
well, just
and we just have to bear a lot of the responsibility for it because we have supported all those elements. We did nothing. We obviously they were dependent, and just like in Ukraine or whatever, we could have put on the brakes and said, okay, wait a second, these ultranationalists or whatever, this is unacceptable. We're going to cut off aid if you don't bring these guys under control. But we never did that. We've just continued. And so they have a sense of impunity, and the ultranationalists have risen to the top in both countries.
Okay. We'll end it here in just a second. Just one last question is, sure. What's next with this nuclear deal with Iran?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It's just that it seems that we're still trying to push the zero enrichment demand on Iran, and Iran just will not accept it. So again, this cannot go ahead. So it's a mess. It's clearly a mess. I think Trump doesn't want to have a war, and in fact, he apparently, he's told Netanyahu to back off and not make any attacks. He's trying to make a deal, but at the same time, he's caving in to all the people that are pressuring him to impose these draconian conditions on Iran. And he just doesn't understand, too, that just like, he thought he could bully the Chinese into accepting, his demands. And he's finding out that he can't. He can't neither can he bully the Iranians. And the Iranians, I think, are, they're feeling they have resisted these demands in the past when they were in a much weaker position. They're in their position has strengthened remarkably over the last several years. Again, they have allies now. They're not isolated. They were really alone and isolated in the world, a decade ago, and certainly 2 decades ago. But they have come in from the cold, or you could say that it's just like, well, they came in from the cold, but now Russia and China, and they all find themselves in the same room, and they all are dealing with the same bully. And so, anyway, they are not alone. They have strengthened themselves economically and militarily, and they have strong allies. And I think there's just no reason that they're going to give in to this. And if it does lead to attack, they feel like they can handle it. I'm sure, they observed what happened in the Red Sea. It's just like they couldn't possibly not notice.
Okay. Well, I feel like we're walking a tightrope.
Yeah, we are.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and end it there, Dad.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Interesting conversation. Have a good rest of your day. Yeah, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.